Crime and Punishment Analysis by Brad Thomas. To understand Crime and Punishment, Book 1, one must not only comprehend the dense writing and the actual historical context, as well as Dostoevsky's personal history and recurring themes in his several works. One must make subtle and nuanced connections between various episodes in the prose, particularly the relationship between Sonia through Raskolnikov's encounter with Marmaladov, and later in Katerina Ivanovna's home. Dunya in the letter from Pulcheria to Raskolnikov, the girl in the street Raskolnikov saves from the dandy looking to violate her, and the horrifying beating to death of Mikolka's horse in Raskolnikov's dream. Within these episodes, we witness Dostoevsky's masterful characterization of Raskolnikov through the description of Luzhin and Raskolnikov's hostility toward Luzhin, which points to Raskolnikov's hostility with himself. In fact, Raskolnikov's characterization is taken up by Dostoevsky's narrator indirectly through Raskolnikov's interaction and thoughts regarding many characters he encounters in the narrative, including the character of Jesus Christ, a constant presence in the text because of Dostoevsky's use of the Gospel of John, the Lazarus motif, Sonia symbolizing the Holy Spirit and the Mary Magdalene prostitute archetype, and the classical Christian Orthodox view of life. It is these scenes, characters, motifs, and archetypes that give us insight into Raskolnikov's flaws and interior conflicts, as well as the themes that Crime and Punishment illustrates and the philosophical arguments Dostoevsky pursues. In Chapter 2, Raskolnikov encounters Marmaladov, Sonia's father, in a pothouse or tavern. We infer that Marmaladov has spent weeks in such establishments, and he tells Raskolnikov he has slept on a hay barge in the Neva, the river that is filthy and comes to represent death later in the narrative when a young woman, filled with what must be overwhelming nihilism and misery, falls into the Neva River to commit suicide. He appeals to Raskolnikov for a polite conversation, which turns from conversation to confession, Raskolnikov uncomfortably and awkwardly serving in some sense as a priest. This awkwardness comes from Raskolnikov's own inner conflict with the classical Orthodox Christian view versus the more modern Western Roman view, as his father's name implies. Raskolnikov is struggling with becoming a son of Rome, of the West, the modern atheist nihilist so many of his generation are adopting, while rejecting the Orthodox Christian heritage that sees meaning to life and truth itself as constant and absolute. Marmaladov thinks Raskolnikov a man of education and not accustomed to drinking, and he respects education when in conjunction with genuine sentiments. In this statement, Marmaladov foreshadows Raskolnikov's hostility with Luzhin, who embodies the Western modern notions of pragmatic utilitarianism, where cost-benefit ratios determine one's choices and practices, like Luzhin's decision to wed Dunya and move Pulcheria and Dunya to Petersburg cheaply, a direct offense to Raskolnikov, who thinks that if a man loves a woman, he honors her by not letting monetary practicality dictate how he treats her. In Raskolnikov's mind, Luzhin should not make Pulcheria and Dunya travel third class by train, nor hire a cheap cart to get them to their lodgings when they arrive in Petersburg, not even showing up to greet them or tend to them when they arrive in Petersburg, as though Dunya is property to be handled. Luzhin embodies the modern man, a practical man. He shares many of the convictions of the rising generation. And Raskolnikov mirrors Luzhin when he thinks about the young girl in danger of being violated by the fat dandy skulking on the corner. A certain percentage of young girls, they tell us, must every year go that way, to the devil. A percentage. What splendid words they have. They are so scientific. Once you've said percentage, there's nothing to worry about. Just prior to this thought, Raskolnikov tells the policeman, who he has given 20 kopecks to help the girl, saving her from the dandy, "Let them be. What is it to do with you? He, the policeman, has carried off my 20 kopecks. Well, let him take as much from the dandy to allow him to have the girl. And why did I want to interfere? Let them devour each other. What is it to me?" Raskolnikov finds Luzhin abhorrent for his monetary calculations when he too expresses the exact same ideas as Luzhin. Ironically, Raskolnikov's greatest frustration with this situation early in the narrative comes because he is powerless, having less money than Lucian and less prestige. Raskolnikov cannot fight and dominate Lucian like he cannot fight and dominate his landlady nor the pawnbroker. He longs to be a Napoleon, but even with someone less intelligent and ridiculous like Lucian, Raskolnikov feels inferior. In this way, we understand Raskolnikov's character and his struggle between the new modern ideas and the classical Orthodox ideas. Ironically, Raskolnikov does not see this in himself. His urge to be a Napoleon is a dominant ideal, if it can be called ideal, for him throughout Crime and Punishment, an ideal Dostoevsky shows us is completely misguided and absolutely wrong by the end of the novel. Marmoladov's coupling of education and genuine sentiments establishes the classical worldview that involves the triune Greek view of humanity, and in some regards the Trinitarian Orthodox Christian view of the imago Dei of humanity. Education signifies cerebral man, the intellectual, thinking, logical element, and genuine sentiments signifies the heart of man, the resting place of emotions, which negotiate between the cerebral and visceral man. The fact that these sentiments are genuine, according to Marmoladov's diction, signifies they are proper emotions, the right kind of emotions that Plato pinpoints when he writes in Laws, the little human animal will not at first have the right response. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred of those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. Ideas from the Abolition of Man, notes by Thomas. Marmoladov tells Raskolnikov, I'm a man of experience, immense experience, sir, signifying visceral man and the existential idea that personal individual action and personal experience, acting on one's own convictions, are essential in arriving at truth. Sadly, Marmoladov's primary conviction is alcohol, pointing to a deeper conviction of moral weakness. Marmoladov, at first glance, seems repugnant, but a closer read of Raskolnikov's encounter explains why Raskolnikov seems to pity Marmoladov and his family. Marmoladov mentions Mr. Lebeziatnikov, who, like Lucian and even Raskolnikov, keeps up with modern ideas. Lebeziatnikov tells Marmoladov that compassion is forbidden nowadays by science itself. This is the same Lebeziatnikov that beat Marmoladov's wife, Katerina, with his own hands. We can infer that the beating occurs because Katerina rejected Lebeziatnikov's sexual advances as compensation for the money Marmoladov owed him. That's why Katerina would not overlook Mr. Lebeziatnikov's rudeness to her, and so he gave her a beating for it. Here, Katerina is painted as pitiful, and Marmoladov, in a cryptic allusion to the Sermon on the Mount, tells Raskolnikov of Katerina, weeping and sobbing and wringing her hands, she married me, for she had nowhere to turn. Do you understand, sir? Do you understand what it means when you have absolutely nowhere to turn? Marmoladov reiterates Dostoevsky's theme of the trapped human psyche, expressed as well in Notes from Underground, that is nowhere to turn because the alternatives to the choice made are either as bad or worse, rendering no guarantee of a better quality of life. Katerina marries Marmoladov after being married to a man for love, who in the end beats her like Lebeziatnikov because, it is implied, he turned to gambling, was beholden to loan sharks, and in the stress of it all turns on his once loved Katerina, because she cannot make her way on her own in this patriarchal world. What is her choice but prostitution? She chooses a more acceptable form of prostitution, marrying a man who even before the marriage was a drunk, as Marmoladov admits when he says he was sober for more than a year until he turned back to drink. What seems most insightful to the reader can be easily lost if one sees only the horrors of Katerina's prostitution, instead of following the situation to its logical conclusion. Katerina is not fully responsible for her plight. Part of the responsibility lies in a society that perpetuates the patriarchal system that subjugates women, forcing them to make choices with equally unacceptable or worse consequences. In this society, restorative justice is absent, and righteousness or equity is non-existent. Katerina's situation is nearly perfectly aligned with that of Dunya, who experiences this societal dilemma on two occasions. The first occurs in the countryside. According to Pulcheria, Dunya is scandalized by Marfa Petrovna, at first until the truth is revealed that Svidrigailov, Marfa's husband, propositions Dunya to run away with him, offering her money to do so. Another implicit allusion to the prostitution motif developed early in the novel and extended to all sorts of prostitution, compromising oneself to survive. Dunya rejects Svidrigailov, and Marfa Petrovna apologizes to Dunya, making the rounds in the community to make her lies known so that Dunya will regain her good reputation. Ironically, Dunya's good reputation is besmirched by herself in some fashion when she agrees to marry Luzhin. This is the second occasion. On the face of it, the betrothal to Luzhin appears to be proper and appropriate until we find from Pulcheria in the letter to Raskolnikov that Dunya, who is resolute, sensible, patient, generous, but has a passionate heart, finds no great love either on his side or on hers. However, Luzhin is a very well-to-do man who has already made his fortune and may be of the greatest use to Raskolnikov for his career advancement. Dunya sells herself to Luzhin so that the family, namely her brother, can thrive, a utilitarian ethic. This marriage is simply a business transaction, and this infuriates Raskolnikov, even though on the surface it is entirely proper societally. But what is Dunya and Pulcheria, a widow, to do? They have limited choices in this society, just like Katerina. A difference does exist in the gravity of both situations. Katerina has 3 children when she marries Marmaladov, 3 mouths to feed, 3 to tend to daily. Dunya, on the other hand, has no children from a previous marriage, though she does have her mother to tend to. In both cases, we witness a level of compassion, Katerina thinking of her children and Dunya thinking of her mother and brother. But neither of these situations compares in gravity to Marmaladov's relating the events of Sonia and Katerina. The social dilemmas of Dunya, Katerina, and Sonia are ones of degradation in that word's truest sense. Sonia, who is 18, the daughter of Marmaladov, who has used up the family's money for drink and has even gone to Sonia for prostitution money for drink in the amount of 30 kopecks, an allusion to the Judas betrayal money of the New Testament, represents wisdom. Her proper name, Sophia, means wisdom, and in Dostoevsky's taxonomy, the wisdom of God, or the classical Orthodox view of what true wisdom means, to fear, more accurately, respect with reverence, God, and more specifically, his ways of love, Proverbs 9:10. Sonia fears God, which is to say, she respects God. This seems paradoxical for a young woman who uses the yellow passport, but Marmaladov's recounting of the moment Sonia begins her prostitution displays what can only be called a holy moment. The children are starving. Katerina cannot pay Amalia Fyodorovna Lipoveshel, the landlord, the rent. Marmaladov has drunk all the money, and his daughter is confronted by the thin, emaciated, consumptive Katerina. Sonia said, "Katerina Ivanovna, am I really to do a thing like that?" "And why not?" said Katerina with a jeer. "You are something mighty precious to be so careful of." In this moment, Katerina calls on Sonia to do what Katerina and other women have done to survive: compromise, give themselves away for money. Katerina demands that her stepdaughter sacrifice herself for Katerina and the children, much like Katerina's sacrifice when she married Marmaladov, the drunk thief. The scene upon Sonia's return is rife with deep symbolism. Sonia returns, faces Katerina, and lays 30 rubles on the table in silence. She did not utter a word. She did not even look at her. She picked up the big green drap de dame shawl, put it over her face, and lay down on the bed with her face to the wall. The price echoes the 30 pieces of silver Judas receives to betray Christ. Sonia betrays her imago Dei, her innocence and integrity, for 30 pieces as well. She covers her head in shame and lays down facing the wall. We see Raskolnikov lay down on several occasions and face the wall to turn his back on his deeds. Paradoxically, Sonia's deed is not murdering another, but murdering herself, giving up her life to save the children and Katerina, whose name comes from the Greek katharos, meaning pure and unsullied, another paradoxical reference to a woman who beats her children, coughs up blood, impels her stepdaughter to prostitution, and abuses her drunk husband. This seems anything but pure and unsullied. But it is the level of victimhood of an exemplary woman, educated and from a good family, who has fallen so far that resonates in this moment. Katerina, katharos, personified, has dragged an innocent Sonia, Sophia, into darkness, as Sonia literally is in darkness under the drap des dames because of her betrayal of herself. Sonia lays covered, facing the wall, shuddering. She is weeping, we know. This facing of the wall mirrors Hezekiah in Isaiah 38:2, who is to die from illness. But Hezekiah weeps and prays for God to save him, and God hears his prayer and adds 15 years to his life. Sonia is weeping at the wall, reminiscent of one ill from her sin, seeking salvation, purification, or the ability to live in grace after her unspeakable deed. However, Sonia's sin is not like Katerina's marriage to Marmaladov, nor Dunya's arrangement with Luzhin. Sonia's choice is strictly to save the children and Katerina. Sonia is completely free of self-interest, whereas Katerina and Dunya have a self-interest involved in their choices. We see this difference in Marmaladov's description when Katerina goes to Sonia on the bed and takes to her knees, all evening kissing Sonia's feet, not getting up, then falling asleep in each other's arms, together, yes, and I lay drunk. This image alludes to Jesus' feet being washed and kissed by the woman, most likely a prostitute, some legends say Mary Magdalene, in Luke 7:36 through 50 and John 11:1 and 2. Sonia is like Christ, Imago Dei, sacrificing herself in love to save the children, her family. Dostoevsky implies the inverse regarding Christ. Christ becomes sin, like Sonia, taking on the imago humus, like Sonia, taking on the image of Katerina and her compromise in order to save humanity, like Sonia saves Katerina and the children. Christ becomes one with humanity, just as Sonia becomes one with Katerina. Marmaladov recounts this moment, confessing he is in a drunken stupor. He says Katerina and Sonia were together, united as one. The saintly, Christ-like Sonia united with Katerina, a hearkening to agape love, reconciliation, unity, all Christian Orthodox values. Lest we lack compassion for Marmaladov, we see in Raskolnikov's observation of Marmaladov the true essence of what up until now we have considered a repugnant man. Marmaladov stopped short as though his voice had failed him. He is holding back tears. If we are paying attention, we feel a pang of pity for Marmaladov, especially in the context earlier when he calls himself a pig twice, a reference to an unclean animal in Judaism. Marmaladov has called himself a beast by nature. He says of himself regarding these descriptions, "Behold the man," the very phrase uttered in John 19:5 by those putting Christ on trial. Marmaladov is imago Dei, but in a way we do not expect. He exemplifies the very sinner for whom Christ sacrifices himself. Christ on the cross bearing the burdens of the beast, becoming the beast, so to speak, resembles Marmaladov in that moment, thus saving this drunken failure of a man. Indeed, Marmaladov recognizes his repugnance, but he also evinces a contrite heart. He cannot repair himself from his dissipation and selfishness, from his pig-like behavior, from his beast-like ways, even though he expresses sorrow for it. Near the end of his confession to Raskolnikov, Marmoladov says, "And he, God, will say, 'Come to me. I have already forgiven thee once. I have forgiven thee once. Thy sins, which are many, are forgiven thee, for thou hast loved much. And we shall come forth without shame, and shall stand before him. And he will say unto us, Ye are swine, made in the image of the beast, and with his mark. But come ye also. This is why I received them. Not one of them believed himself to be worthy of this. And he will hold out his hands to us, and we shall fall down before him, and we shall weep, and we shall understand all things, and all will understand. Katerina Ivanovna even, she will understand. Lord, thy kingdom come." Marmoladov's words contextually apply to Sonia, Katerina, the children, and even himself, as well as to all humanity. When Marmoladov says, "all will understand," he expresses the revelation of unconditional love that opens the eyes of oneself not only to a loving God, but to the motivations for the actions of others that appear on the surface to be morally wrong. Whether we speak of Sonia prostituting herself, Dunya prostituting herself to Luzhin, Katerina prostituting herself to Marmoladov, or Marmoladov prostituting himself to alcohol to plumb the depths of depression and feeling because he cannot cope with the misery of not only his own life, but the lives of Katerina and their children. Marmoladov expresses a Greek Orthodox doctrine of judgment, where even those who the religious see as abhorrent and unworthy will be counted beautiful and deserving of redemption because of their humility, not counting themselves as worthy. Their heart disposition is one of responsibility for their sinful actions in a broken world. They lost their imago Dei, taking on the mark of the imago Bestia, because of choices in a broken world, and because they recognize this in themselves, they are worthy of love and belonging. Existentially, they take responsibility for their choices and admit their regret. Thus, they are free to be authentically themselves. The judgment Marmoladov describes opens the eyes of all humans to see not only their sin, but the level of victimization their sin caused in the lives of others. They not only see Christ on the cross as washing away their sin, but all that is broken in the world, all that compromising humans must do to survive, all the horrors that societies exact on humans throughout time. Even the victimizers will see how their actions victimized their victims, and the victims will see their pain as victims on the cross. Everyone will come to know Christ's saving grace because God's love triumphs over all. In this way, everything is made new, and it is this Eastern Orthodox idea Dostoevsky implies in Marmoladov's words. Marmoladov's words create a moment of silence, as if in the tavern a deep truth has been revealed, and those listening are pondering a deep revelation. The moment passes, and laughter and oaths begin again, the tavern crowd continuing to berate, taunt, and ridicule the drunk Marmoladov. In all his repugnance, Marmoladov, Dostoevsky seems to imply, is still worthy of redemption, of a second, third, or fourth chance, because he is us and we are him at different gradations on the same scale, or perhaps more accurately, different degradations on the same scale, which no measure of justice can balance. Only unconditional love, grace, can do that. And that grace, displayed in Sonia, entails sacrifice. Marmoladov serves to prick the conscience of Raskolnikov, just as Marmoladov is about to weep from recounting the scene 6 days previous when he brought Katerina his first earnings in full, 23 rubles, 40 kopecks altogether. She called him her puppet, and when they were by themselves, you understand? This insinuates a moment of sexual intimacy, a bit disturbing because the money Katerina receives from Marmoladov leads to sex. However, the difference lies in the fact that Marmeladov is providing for his wife, though contextually, with all the compromising women in this story and society must do to survive it, it suggests a transactional relationship, like Lucian and Dunya. Katerina's affection for Marmeladov shows us the heart of this pathetic man when his chin begins to twitch, insinuating he is about to cry because he longs to be loved and counts himself unworthy of that love and belonging, the very definition of shame. Seeing Marmeladov in this state moves Raskolnikov. The tavern, the degraded appearance of the man, the 5 nights on the hay barge, and the pot of spirits, and yet this poignant love for his wife and children bewildered his listener. Raskolnikov listened intently, but with a sick sensation. He felt vexed that he had come here. Why vexed? Because Marmeladov is a man of deep feeling who loves deeply and feels unworthy of love. Raskolnikov feels vexed and sick because of the conflict within him between the two worldviews, the modern, Roman, nihilistic, atheistic view versus the classical, Christian, Orthodox view. Marmeladov's story is no longer a head story. It is a heart story, and Raskolnikov must avoid the heart. Otherwise, Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker, becomes a person with a soul and not simply a theoretical principle to be extinguished for justice, the euphemism for what must be Raskolnikov's jealousy and resentment of the old woman. At every turn of the narrative, Raskolnikov must confront his innate heart nature, even though he thinks he wants to simply follow his head nature. Raskolnikov expresses his head nature numerous times, whether we talk of his regret at having given the police officer 20 kopecks to take the scandalized young girl home, or when he leaves the change in his pocket for Katerina and the children on the windowsill, thinking after he leaves, what a stupid thing I've done. They have Sonia, and I want it myself. Stupid and myself. 2 words of intellect that do not consider kindness nor compassion, both traits of the heart. Raskolnikov says of Sonia's industry, what a mine they've dug there. They've wept over it and grown used to it. Man grows used to everything, the scoundrel. Mine, an industrial, practical, pragmatic word coupled with scoundrel, a moral word. Raskolnik, meaning schismatic, manifests in these lines, expressing our protagonist's conflicted existence. He thinks, what if man is not really a scoundrel? Man in general, I mean the whole race of mankind, then all the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers, and it's all as it should be. The world as it should be? Humanity is morally good of its own accord? Only prejudging and invented fear in specific humans is the problem? Of course, either way, Raskolnikov demonstrates just the opposite. We learn of Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker, that in her home, a light was burning before a small icon. Everything was very clean. The floor and furniture were brightly polished. Everything shone. We learn that every time Raskolnikov passes his landlady's kitchen, he had a sick, frightened feeling which made him scowl and feel ashamed. He was afraid of meeting her. His prejudice toward Alyona Ivanovna's age and what he perceives as greed, which is actually just a woman figuring out a way to live cleanly within the law to make a wage in this patriarchal society, and his fear of the landlady due to his poverty are nothing more than a prejudiced and fearful man who wants to be superior in every way to others, a Napoleon, in Nietzsche's terms, an Übermensch, but alas, finds himself inferior socioeconomically to the landlady and both morally and economically inferior to the God-fearing, clean-living Alyona Ivanovna. Raskolnikov embodies the prejudice and artificial terrors or fears he criticizes, and in trying to be one who is as he should be, commits murder. If we want to demonize Raskolnikov, well and good, but we do so to our own detriment, because this schismatic mind also practices kindnesses with the scandalized girl, Katerina, her children, and even Marmeladov as Raskolnikov walks the drunk man home. and he will do more kindnesses, even while he will murder two innocent enough women who live in a fairly cruel patriarchal world, at best indifferent and at worst hostile toward them simply because of their gender. They are innocent enough because it becomes obvious that every human being is a part of the ant heap, filled with all kinds of beings doing both good and evil, and often doing both day in and day out. Therefore, killing two women might be justified in a nihilistic modern taxonomy of the age, but just where does that get humanity? Extinction? Or just the few most powerful and passionate remaining who care not a whit for equality, justice, and especially love? Practical? Perhaps. Useful? Possibly. Fulfilling? To the powerful few, we can suppose. Who decides life and death in this taxonomy? The most powerful and most passionate? How much of humanity does that count out on a planet of 8 billion humans currently? Raskolnikov embodies the philosophical dilemma not only of his age, but of ours as well. The postmodern society has deconstructed all reference of a unified truth, whether we speak of religions, states, or education, all three major institutions which now face scrutiny, skepticism, if not outright hostility, because the foundations of what is right and what is wrong no longer exist, if they existed at all in any world system invented by humanity. Postmodern, post-Christian, anti-government, anti-education, all swirl in the context of our current global society. Is freedom from the same as freedom to? Raskolnikov seems to be seeking a freedom to do whatever he wants, but he struggles to experience freedom from the internal conscience that keeps confronting him within. The question for Raskolnikov seems to be, what do I want the freedom to do? The nihilistic age seems to answer, whatever you want. However, Raskolnikov's heart asks, what do I want freedom from? The classical view seems to answer, the tyranny of my self-interest. And so Dostoevsky seems to imply, through our encounters with Sonia, Katerina, Dunya, and Marmaladov, an answer in the form of a question to Raskolnikov's schismatic dilemma. What does love require? A partial answer to this question evinces in a dream. Raskolnikov's dream in chapter 5 brings together numerous themes and motifs swirling through book 1. In the dream, the day is gray and heavy, reckoning to Raskolnikov's clouded and dark mind, like Adrian Rich's storm warnings. The horrifying scene takes place just outside a tavern, reckoning back to Raskolnikov's encounter with Marmaladov and the heartless crowd who berates and ridicules the pathetic, unemployed government official. The crowd that gathers to Mikolka parallels the cruel crowd in Marmaladov's pothouse. In the dream, Raskolnikov, walking with his father, who is deceased, decries an aching absence, not just of his actual father, but of the heavenly Father, who in the rising generation of the day is irrelevant or dead, as Nietzsche will famously state in some 30 or so years. We know Raskolnikov's father represents God because as the beast of burden is being murdered by Mikolka and his band of scoundrels, Raskolnikov cries out, "Father, Father, Father, what are they doing?" Reminiscent of Christ on the cross who says, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," or my God, why have you forsaken me?" Christ also says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." In the dream, the father's reaction is to grab his son by the hand and take him away from the horrifying scene of injustice, paralleling Christ's words saying, "They are drunk, they are brutal, it's not our business." This relates to Raskolnikov's immersion in the nihilism and atheism of his contemporaries. God does not exist in the rising generation's mind, but if he does exist, he doesn't seem to care and walks away from the brutal scenes of St. Petersburg and the rest of the world. It's as if Raskolnikov is expressing his attempt to reject the classical view because it just doesn't work. The Father God does nothing to rescue the mayor, nor stop the brutal crowd who is drunk, just as the Father God allows horrible evil in the world. Dostoevsky's subtlety here shows brilliance. The drunk Marmaladov, who calls himself a beast, parallels Mikolka and his horde, but they differ in a drastic, nuanced way. The father in the dream turns his back on the mare and the horde, inferring they are not worthy enough for the father or the 7-year-old Raskolnikov to intervene. But Marmaladov, in his rendition of the final judgment, expresses a father who intervenes for him, a beast, and for all, who rescues all the horde, who does not turn his back on anyone. In this subtle difference, we see how Raskolnikov fails to understand a view of the Father, God, through Christ on the cross, who stands in the way of suffering and takes the suffering, just as the boy, Raskolnikov, stands between the mare and its torturer and executioner. Biblically, the way to restoration for Israel and all peoples in the New Testament is symbolically alluded to when Raskolnikov, the 7-year-old, runs to the suffering beast of burden, the mare, to lay between her and the thrashing Mikolka and horde, an allusion to Isaiah 11, when the Christ or Messiah will restore Israel in the just kingdom he will establish through standing in the gap between destruction and life, taking on the suffering of the broken and marginalized of the world, aka all of humanity, while the father in the dream turns away, symbolic of a holy, meaning separate and apart, God who cannot be in sin's presence. Raskolnikov runs to the mare, echoing through his action Isaiah 11:6. The wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. This new kingdom is utterly upside down from the czars, the nihilists and their communist revolution, the Romans symbolically significant in the novel, or any world system in history. Even what is natural, a wolf devouring a lamb, is abolished with the supernatural, indeed the anti-natural, occurring. The lamb is Christ. The child is Christ, the Son of God. In the dream, Raskolnikov is the Christ child figure, lying down with the mare, while the wolf, Mikolka, preys upon the female beast of burden, symbolic of Sonia, Lizaveta, Pulcheria, Katerina, and Dunya. In the New Testament, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Raskolnikov is the child. Mikolka and his companions exemplify those who will not turn from their ways. But Marmaladov, in his confession to Raskolnikov in the pothouse, exemplifies an almost childlike faith, as mentioned earlier. That Raskolnikov is the Christ child in the dream emphasizes his struggle between the modern atheist nihilist and the classical Christian Orthodox taxonomies. This idea of Raskolnikov's struggle with the two worldviews heightens when he recounts in the dream the little chapel where he would take communion 2 or 3 times a year with his parents in remembrance of his grandmother. This detail shows the classical Christian Orthodox view as old and traditional because they are celebrating a past generation, the grandmother. Where is the chapel? In a graveyard, symbolic of death. What is dead in Raskolnikov's mind? God and the Orthodox classical tradition. But the conflict between the schismatic Raskolnikov still remains. In the dream, we find that he loved that church, the old-fashioned, unadorned icons and the old priest with the shaking head. Notice the parallel to Alyona Ivanovna, who has an unadorned icon in her flat, is old-fashioned, and represents everything wrong with the world in Raskolnikov's estimation. In Raskolnikov's mind, the old ways don't work, supposedly. The mare represents much of Raskolnikov's subconscious mind. It is a beast of burden. It carries the load of others. Sonia, Katerina, and Dunya also carry others' loads. The mare is female, as are the aforementioned characters. It is stuck in the mud or in a rut, as are the women of St. Petersburg. the peasants would beat the mare so cruelly, like Katerina beats her children, innocents, and like the young girl on the street who is scandalized and about to be again by the dandy if Raskolnikov does not intercede. Mikolka says of the mare, "I feel as if I could kill her. She's just eating her head off." The mare parallels the women. Subconsciously, Raskolnikov, paralleling Mikolka, feels the same way about the pawnbroker. She is taking up space in society, and he could just kill her because she is a nuisance and a hindrance, though it is clear that Alyona Ivanovna takes care of Lizaveta, who is not capable of taking care of herself, we infer. Mikolka calls the mare my property, just like Lushin treats Dunya, which infuriates Raskolnikov. Mikolka is called a devil by one of the drunken horde, heightening the symbolic nature of the beast of burden as Christ on the cross, who becomes sin, becomes the beast, imago bestia, that is, humanity, in order to save humanity from its drunken stupor of pride, power, arrogance, and sin. The mare is whipped as Christ is scourged by the Roman soldiers. The mare is mocked by the drunken horde as Christ is mocked, and as Marmaladov is mocked by the tavern crowd. The mare is hit in the face and the eyes, beaten with a pipe and an axe. The axe, Raskolnikov's murder weapon of choice, pointing to his subconscious recognition that he is killing a woman who is in a rut, bearing burdens, and innocent of doing anything more wrong than any other in the ugly, dusty, crowded streets of St. Petersburg. Mikolka's name has the root kol for bell, pointing to the bell motif, like the bell that Raskolnikov rings at the pawnbroker's, and the chapel in the dream that has a cupola, which must contain a bell. The bell represents death, as in John Donne's Meditation 17. Mikolka is every man, a devil, who brings enslavement to women, my property, and murders them physically and emotionally, like Raskolnikov does Alyona Ivanovna, like Svidrigailov murders his servant girl, Pashara, and murders emotionally Dunya. Mikolka butchers the mare, like Raskolnikov butchers Alyona and Lizaveta. And the horde says of Mikolka, no mistake about it, you are not a Christian. Mirroring Raskolnikov's psyche that he too is not a Christian, but a Napoleon, because he kills Alyona and Lizaveta. Ironically, Raskolnikov, the little boy in the dream, the Christ child symbolically, runs to the mare and embraces it, becomes one with it, like Katerina and Sonia on the bed after Sonia is brutally violated. The murderer of Alyona and Lizaveta, two women, embraces the object of his murder, the mare, feeling premeditated compassion and regret subconsciously for Alyona and Lizaveta, who are as much a victim of the Mikolkas of the world as anyone. We know this because when he awakens, he immediately thinks, can it be that I shall really take an axe, that I shall strike her on the head, split her skull open, that I shall tread in the sticky warm blood, break the lock, steal and tremble, hide all the spattered blood with the axe? Good God, can it be? The very thought of it made me feel sick and filled me with horror. Raskolnikov psychologically does not understand that to kill Alyona Ivanovna is to kill Sonia, Dunya, Katerina, and the scandalized girl on the street. They are all one, together. They are all being murdered by this modern-minded patriarchal society filled with men who want to be Napoleons, and Raskolnikov is struggling to be one of them. Societies, including Russia in this case, ignore the offer of a different world system where wolf lies down with lamb, continuing to embrace the old world system, believing the Napoleonism of the day is new, a lie as old as the archetypal garden story of humanity itself. In chapter 3 of book 1, Raskolnikov receives a letter and some money from Pulcheria, his mother. This letter establishes several themes, some of which have already been discussed, but a detailed examination of the letter renders some minute details that cast light, as Dostoevsky is wont to do, on major themes in this masterpiece. First, Pulcheria's name comes from the Latin root pulcher, meaning beautiful or nice. It is the same root for the word pulchritude, meaning physical beauty. Pulcheria is 43. Her face still retained traces of her former beauty. She looked much younger and retained serenity of spirit, sensitiveness, and pure, sincere warmth of heart. She had a handsome face. She was Dunya over again, 20 years older. In her there was honesty, principle, and the deepest convictions which nothing would convince her to cross. She is aptly named as we find that both her children, Raskolnikov and Dunya, are physically beautiful. Raskolnikov was, by the way, exceptionally handsome, above the average in height, slim, well-built, with beautiful dark eyes and dark brown hair. Avdotia Romanovna, Dunya, was remarkably good-looking. She was tall, strikingly well-proportioned, strong, and self-reliant, which did not detract from the grace and softness of her movements. She resembled her brother, but she might be described as really beautiful. Her hair was dark brown, a little lighter than her brother's. There was a proud light in her almost black eyes, and yet at times a look of extraordinary kindness. Her face was radiant with freshness and vigor. We see the physical striking beauty as defined in ancient Greek culture that runs through this family, and we see the stream of pride that runs through the family line as well. Dunya displaying a measure of pride that displays integrity balanced with kindness and deference. Pulcheria displaying a measure of pride that more often bends to circumstances, even if questionable, for example, Dunya's marriage to Lucian. And Raskolnikov displaying a pride that is anything but measured, leading him to murder in the name of integrity. But it is clear this is a handsome family in appearance, on the surface. As the narrative suggests, Dunya is Rodia without the Napoleon complex and with a sense of balance between the three elements of the Greek view of humanity, the cerebral, the visceral, and the heart of man. We see this in her actions with Svidrigailov, both in the letter from Pulcheria to Rodia and near the end of the narrative when Svidrigailov entraps Dunya in his apartment. In the most distressful of situations, Dunya acts in as balanced a fashion as possible. She writes a letter to Svidrigailov about why she cannot run off with him, as it would be morally wrong and destroy his marriage and Marfa Petrovna. Even near the end of the story, when she uses the gun against Svidrigailov, who is blackmailing her to sleep with him after he has locked her in his apartment, she misses at practically point-blank range, wounding his ear. We infer she cannot and would not bring herself to the point of killing someone, even someone who may very well deserve it because he is a scoundrel. Dunya contrasts Raskolnikov, who is willing to kill Alyona Ivanovna, someone who, for all her faults, is in no way the villain Svidrigailov evinces and, as mentioned earlier, represents the marginalized, a woman who is trying to survive in this patriarchal world system and protect another woman, namely Lizaveta. Curiously, Dunya is in physicality the female version of her brother, but in temperament, morally far superior. In fact, when we look at Dunya and Sonia, we find in the novel perhaps our two most admirable characters in terms of morality. Sonia, of course, being the most moral, and Dunya, because of her pragmatism regarding Lucian, perhaps a little less on the moral scale than Sonia. We also see Dunya's sense of morality in her attraction and eventual marriage to Razumikin, who, of all the male characters in the novel, though a bit enthusiastic at times, exemplifies the balanced man in the Greek view of humanity. Razumikin displays humility when he tells Pulcheria and Dunya, "Through error you come to truth. I am a man because I err. You never reach any truth without making 14 mistakes, and very likely 114. Razumikin possesses a growth mindset. He displays existential individual responsibility when he tells the women to go wrong in one's own way is better than to go right in someone else's. In the first case, you are a man. In the second, you're no better than a bird." And he identifies the bird as Raskolnikov when he calls Rodia a plagiarist and a translation instead of an original. Because while Raskolnikov wants to be a Napoleon, thinking himself above the herd, To Razumikin, Raskolnikov is just stealing the philosophy of others as his own, the definition of plagiarism, and closely resembling all the other nihilists of the age, like a translation of an original idea. He tells Raskolnikov that he is not thinking for himself, which seems to be accurate. Razumikin thinks, feels, and acts appropriately, albeit a little too enthusiastically in his first encounter with Pulcheria and Dunya. Illusion serves as a nemesis, if not a direct mirror, for Raskolnikov of what the modern nihilist looks like. He is a counselor, a lawyer, exactly what Raskolnikov is studying to be. He is a pragmatic utilitarian businessman, a creation of the age of Bentham and Mills, a man of practicality as evidenced when he writes a letter to Pulcheria and Dunya and very courteously made an offer of marriage and begged for a speedy and decided answer, inferring that love or sentiments have little to do with what is good, good being defined as expedience and usefulness. Dunya will be useful to him. Raskolnikov thinks the same of Alyona Ivanovna's death. He can be depended upon, according to Pulcheria, because he is well-to-do and has made his fortune already. Pulcheria says twice that he is conceited, likes to be listened to, and is an outspoken man. From this we gather that Luzhin is a narcissist. He made up his mind to marry a girl of good reputation without dowry, aka poor, and above all, one who had experienced poverty, because, as he explained, a man ought not be indebted to his wife, but that it is better for a wife to look upon her husband as her benefactor. This strikes Pulcheria as somewhat rude. From this, we gather Luzhin is a man steeped in the patriarchal mindset, or in other words, a male chauvinist who sees women as inferior and dependent. While we may not think of Raskolnikov in this way, it is clear he thinks himself above the pawnbroker and his landlady, and his treatment of Sonia at times is horrible. He also expects his word to be treated as law when he forbids Dunya from marrying Luzhin, saying, "You are marrying Luzhin for my sake. I won't accept the sacrifice. And so write a letter before tomorrow to refute him, and that will be the end of it." In many ways, Raskolnikov mirrors Luzhin, whom he loathes, implying that subconsciously he loathes himself. Pulcheria's closing remarks in the letter speak volumes about Raskolnikov implicitly. She writes, "Love Dunya, your sister," implying she knows the tension Dunya's marriage will have on Rodya because it is a sacrifice for him and for his well-being in business. Pulcheria seems to fear Rodya's deep, dark, and impassioned moods when she says, "If only you are happy, we shall be happy," meaning Raskolnikov has the ability to make everyone miserable or peaceful depending on his disposition. Pulcheria must fear that Rodya is losing his moral compass. Do you still say your prayers, Rodya, and believe in the mercy of our Creator and Redeemer? I am afraid in my heart that you may have been visited by the new spirit of infidelity that is abroad today. Something in the past must have happened that causes Pulcheria to be troubled that her son is becoming a modern nihilist. The undercurrents of power and pride flow through this letter, which seems on the surface to be quite innocent. Raskolnikov embodies the modern definition of righteousness, which focuses on being right and set apart or pure, ironically, a fundamental religious ideal embraced by the greatest enemies of Christ, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the chief priests of the temple. In their zealotry to usher in the Messiah and kingdom, they thought purity, looking good, and being right would expedite God's reign, a geographical reign exactly like all world systems throughout history, where power and domination over all people groups other than the people of Israel would come. Raskolnikov plays jazz with this idea. Instead of the chief priests of religion, Judaism, the modern nihilists, with faith in knowledge alone, the cerebral man, with knowing he or she is right, will usher in a world system based on fact, expedience, and utility, a brave new world. This anticipates Raskolnikov's dream in the epilogue of Crime and Punishment. That Christ is rejected by people espousing such ideas is not shocking, since these are an old story dressed up in new clothes, the perpetual world system since the beginning of humanity. The ideals, if they can be called that, of the modern Napoleon nihilist, Dostoevsky seems to be asserting, are new shiny fruit from the same old Eden tree. The classical Christian Orthodox view, of course, throughout history, has been hijacked by such fruit eaters as well. For what can be more powerful and insidious than manipulation of the principles of love? Throughout history, we often witness in Western Christendom movements where the wolf devours the lamb instead of lying down as one with it, or, in Crime and Punishment, the child lies down with the mare. Righteousness in the Christian Orthodox view has less to do with the individuals being right and more to do with having right relationships or being in community with one another. It embraces justice, not with retribution or punishment, but with restoration, relational. Raskolnikov, the schismatic person, as his name implies, struggles with retributive justice, killing the pawnbroker as punishment for what he conceives of as her crimes, a very modern nihilistic utilitarian view, versus restorative justice, finding common ground with others, forgiving them, and focusing on loving relationships through sacrifice and mercy, through equity, a very classical Christian Orthodox view. That Christ is hated, literally separated from, by the very people he most closely identifies with, those who claim to love God and want his kingdom to come, displays the schism between all world systems and the New Testament's reimagining of God, especially the Gospel of John. In Dostoevsky's novel, God is love, and love alone, and the most unexpected humans will be primarily in his love, not those of merit, of power, of fame, even of good religiousness. The prostitutes, Sonia, and sinners are actually entering into this completely other kingdom first, though others are entering last, because they live love, restorative justice, righteously, which is to say, in right relationship with others. One of the central teachings of Jesus is that one must love God and one must love others. Neither of these takes precedence over the other. In other words, they are one and the same, together. One cannot do one without the other. To love others is to love God. In this way, the radical definition of God comes through. God's righteousness is not just about being holy. It is about being in right relationship with his creation, humanity, and he does whatever it takes to do that, including conforming to humanity by becoming human himself, sacrificing himself, and dying, the ultimate act of love. This is the conflict Raskolnikov faces within his schismatic self. Raskolnikov twists this sacrificial love of God to suit the old lie world system when he tells Sonia what must be done to rescue the likes of Katerina's children and even Sonia herself. What's to be done? Break what must be broken, like Alyona the pawnbroker. Once for all, that's all. And take the suffering on oneself, sacrifice oneself by murdering and overpowering and going to jail to be punished, the retributive justice model. What? You don't understand? Freedom and power, and above all, power, over all trembling creation and all the ant heap. That's the goal. Remember that. Raskolnikov has eaten the fruit from the tree of the old lie. The fact that he thinks by murdering and serving time for the murder is a sacrifice shows his enslavement to the retributive, individualistic, modern, nihilistic world system. The fact that he thinks killing Alyona, who he turns into an idea or principle, is good shows his lack of righteousness, defined as living in right relationship based on equity, the restorative, classical Christian Orthodox view. For Raskolnikov, power is above all else and contrasts with a czar, if you will, whose defining practice is that of humility, weakness, surrender, and sacrifice, a New Testament of true strength, Christ. In short, when Raskolnikov sees humanity as an ant heap, he fails to be right.